This week on The Thinking Muslim, we have the economics editor of the Times of London to talk about the economic impacts of the Iran war.
We've already entered the doomsday scenario.
Starmer, Prime Minister of the UK, gave a speech earlier today about the potential sort of energy crisis that's looming in Britain.
The European Commission this week basically told people to work from home, drive less, take fewer showers. Japan, the world's third largest economy, which relies on 90% of all of its energy needs from that particular choke point. We're now talking about structural damage to the biggest gas field in the world, because you may just be creating these very resilient monsters, which then you have to go to war with. We don't know what's happening next in a world where the US is no longer a reliable partner.
The MBS yesterday signed an agreement with Ukraine. It was done behind America's back. Do you feel with current trends that we've sort of reached the end of liberal capitalism?
Islam invented everything that we now call free trade and globalization. The good and the fair merchant is a man who is close to God. If free trade is disappearing, maybe it's our responsibility to bring it back.
Mehreen Khan, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome back to The Thinking Muslim.
Walaikum salam. Thank you so much for having me back.
Well, it's great to have you with us. And today we're going to talk about the economic impacts and maybe repercussions of this last month, of this war that Israel and America started on Iran. And we're going to, I think, just take a deep dive, make a deep dive into the economic impacts and how the Muslim world and the Western world is going to be impacted by what we've witnessed over this past month. Now, let's start with the extreme, the doomsday assessment that suggests that these economic shocks that we're feeling at the moment, the supply crisis when it comes to energy, that's not just a temporary phenomenon, but actually it's going to be felt for years ahead. And like, how much do you read into that?
I think to some degree we've already entered the doomsday scenario.
Really?
And the only way you can do that is by comparing what people said beforehand about how this could be a short, sharp operation like a 12-day war.
Yeah.
The head of the International Energy Agency, Fatih Birol, has already called this supply shock worse than the multiple supply shocks of the 70s and of the gas crisis that we all suffered in 2022. 30% of the world's oil supplies comes through the Strait of Hormuz. Around 20% of LNG comes through this choke point. There are countries, massive economies like Japan, the world's third largest economy, which relies on 90% of all of its energy needs from that particular choke point. These are industrialized economies. These are rich world economies. And we'll also go on and talk about the poor world economies who are also going to be, I think, the biggest losers from the war. And it's not just a commodity story, interestingly. There are, and we've all become experts in the byproducts like helium, aluminium, fertilizer. These are all parts of the global economy's supply chains for things like productions of semiconductors, for food prices going forward. We're in spring. This is when farmers plant crops and they need fertilizers. All of this is kind of coming to a head. But I think to definitively conclude about whether doomsday will happen or not, it's just quite literally a question of duration. I'm speaking to you 5 weeks into a war. That's probably already 2 weeks longer than most of the hawkish assessments would have been at the start on February the 28th. I checked the betting markets this morning. There is a 60% likelihood that this war will be over by the end of April, which would have taken us to a 2-month point, and only a 20% chance that this conflict lasts until June. Now, everything that I'm going to tell you is going to be contingent on how long this kinetic phase of the war will continue. I'm sort of the opinion that this war will not end in any conventional sense. I think this phase of the war will end. But if we think that this war started with the 12-day war, then we've basically been in different phases of conflict since the summer. And that's the situation in which I think, talking about doomsday, it's not particularly alarmist. And we'll talk about the reasons why, but mainly because of the supply shocks are not just like what happened with Russia, for example. We had a country that was a major producer of oil and gas, potentially mainly for Europe. We sanctioned that country, and Europe found different ways and different markets to get their energy needs.
Yeah.
We're now talking about structural damage to the biggest gas field in the world. We're talking about a choke point, which is as important as the Suez Canal was in the mid-20th century for the running of the global economy. And we're talking about an actor, Iran, which we can probably say will be heavily emboldened by everything that's happened in the last month. So I think the economic and geo-economic consequences are much more wide-ranging than a 12-day war situation or even a Ukraine-Russia situation. So in that sense, I think we are talking about something that is reasonably without precedent.
And we're talking on the 1st of April, and Starmer, Prime Minister of the UK, gave a speech earlier today about the potential sort of energy crisis that's looming in Britain. I know the Germans have talked about possibly cutting back on energy usage. Albanese in Australia gave a speech earlier on as well, where he talked about the need for Australians to sort of tighten their belts a little bit. Are we going to witness a crisis here in the West with inflation, with energy shortages? I mean, are we at that stage yet?
I think if we concentrate on the Western impact, I think we are talking about another leg of an affordability crisis, which we experienced in 2022. So the cost of living issue, which has become the foremost economic question for all governments in the West, it brought down basically every incumbent government in a 2024 range of elections. So that the question about the Western economies is about how to handle the inflationary impacts, how their central banks handle it, and whether their governments have enough fiscal room to cushion the impact on people in terms of their energy bills. We are heading into the spring. So actually, if you see the LNG market, it hasn't been as dislocated as it was in 2022, mainly because it's a bit warmer. Nobody's really putting their heating on. But historically, European energy levels, storage levels are very, very low. And the interesting thing about the Europeans was that they did wean themselves very successfully, actually, off Russian gas. But that did mean that they became more reliant on countries like Qatar for the same supply of gas. They also became very reliant on the United States. The two of them probably represent 20% each of the global LNG market. I think the question in Western governments is very much about policy and whether they can make the right policy. We are sitting very close to the Central Bank of the UK. I think the knee-jerk reaction of these countries would be to raise interest rates again because they're so scared about the fact that they didn't do it fast enough last time. This has big consequences for your mortgage. This has big consequences for the cost of money for investment, for weak job markets in Europe, the UK and the US. And it has financial implications too. Because before, if I sat here at the beginning of the year and I said to you, what's the outlook for financial markets? Everyone's like, it's great. Finally, 2026 is going to be a year where we get interest rate cuts. And so much of the world's important assets, like bond prices, are priced off that expectation. For the chancellor of this country, she really needed some lower interest rates just to make the fiscal arithmetic add up. So the question in the West is going to be domestic, how they deal with it on their domestic households, whether they can subsidize people's energy. I think the European Commission this week basically told people to work from home, drive less, take fewer showers. So this is real world impacts on reducing energy consumption to kind of soften the blow. I still think the story in the West is difficult politically, but if we're really talking about the pain points for the world, I'm thinking about the world's poorer economies. The world's poorest economies are the ones who were incredibly fragile, who will now be thrown into another round of turmoil with no obvious way of them getting out of it. And we can talk about some of those countries as well.
Yeah, we'll do that. I wonder whether electorally, at least here in the West, we're going to see, because you said in 2024, the cost of living crisis was really the issue in those elections, across both sides of the Atlantic. I wonder whether in France, I know you've reported quite a lot in past days, and in Europe, here in the UK. I wonder whether we're going to see a further lurch to the right, with National Front and Farage and others winning elections, because there seems to be now a sort of almost a structural economic crisis in these countries.
Yes, I would say that there is no automaticity in cost of living crisis actually feeding into the far right, because actually what the problem with these parties on the right is that they have been Trump friendly or Trump adjacent. Now we all know, and it's self-evident, that this was a war of choice conducted by a US president with aims that we're not particularly sure of. But we're seeing already the fact that European governments are getting slightly braver as we speak in saying, no, we're not going to be helping you out in your military excursions, which is partly a reflection of the deep domestic, I think, antipathy and hostility that Europeans have towards Donald Trump. Now, the liability issue is that these parties on the right, especially Farage, have been very Trump adjacent. They basically stole all of his economic policies, and we say we want to do exactly what Trump's doing. So in that sense, it's not going to be helpful. I think what we can say is that any party, I think, party of not of the mainstream, which makes affordability and cost of living central to its economic message, is probably going to get some cut through. And here the examples, of course, are Mamdani in New York, where basically it was just an affordability message. And therefore he did probably attract voters from the left and the right. Yeah. And in this country, so far, that was the playbook of the Greens, where affordability was basically everything in by-election campaigns, in what's going to be the May local elections. So I think that is the message, that if the incumbent governments don't have options and tools, anyone offering to really say, our job is going to make sure that your rents don't go up, that your energy bills are stable, whether that's because we develop more green technology, we become more energy, we have more energy security, that we reduce our reliance on international supply chains by becoming more resilient. These are all messages that I think are up for grabs. It's not obvious to me that the right will monopolize this territory, mainly because they're completely also untested in the economic sphere. Yeah. And I'm not sure about the latest polling, but Reform have never polled well on the economic question. And Nigel Farage has been on record saying that he would probably accelerate or want to have a financial crisis in this country. So about 6 months ago, he was talking about the fact that we need to be bailed out by the IMF. And he was talking about it in the sense that there was a necessary purge that needed to happen. Let's have a financial crisis because the ruins of that financial crisis are going to bring me into power. I think there's incredibly dangerous messaging, talking about IMF bailouts, which was all the rage in this country not so long ago. So I think actually this is much more of a problem for them, for their geopolitical stance, for their foreign policy, and basically a test of their economic credentials. So I wouldn't say that this is some kind of open goal for the far right, not at all. If anything, the left should be getting getting its messaging in order in terms of how to fix affordability issues.
And Mehreen, you're the economics editor for Times, the Times of London, and you assess and look at sort of the broader macro picture of the world economy. Do you feel with current trends that we've sort of reached the end of liberal capitalism? You know, that dream that Francis Fukuyama talked of, where liberal democracy and capitalism would be the end of history. Have we got to a stage where we're now moving beyond that?
I think it's happened in slow motion, that this kind of paradigm, what we call globalization and free trade, the idea that when countries trade with one another, they exchange, they create mutual dependencies which are good for both parties, which are accelerators of peace, which create peace between nations, is a fantastic idea. I think Islamically, there is a lot of value in the idea that trade and exchange creates bonds between human beings and societies. And it's worked until it stopped working. And you could probably maybe mark the end of it around the financial crisis. And what we're seeing now is the entry of, I think, zero-sum thinking in our politics and also in our economics. That if one country, say China, is becoming economically powerful, that means it becomes militarily powerful and politically powerful. And the other country in the world, the United States, is not going to tolerate an actor like China having that degree of, mercantilist power. I think of it in the term of a return of modern mercantilism. I think that is the paradigm we are living in. A lot of people say, it's kind of like we don't know where we are. There's a kind of interregnum. There's a period in which free trade and globalization is ending, but we don't know what's happening next. I think we already know. And this is what I would term a kind of a mercantilist idea, where basically there are no partners. All dependencies are weaknesses because they can be weaponized by the other side, whether it's China giving you lots of green technology or their domination of supply chains or the reliance on the dollar. Every country can turn around and use it as a weapon against you and a weapon of domination. That's what we saw in the 1930s and the 1920s with Nazi Germany. That's what we saw basically throughout from the 17th century onwards with Britain, the Netherlands, France, basically always going to war for resources and territory because that's what power was. The point of being a rich country is to be a powerful country. And I think we're now entering into the world where the point of having wealth is so you can dominate other countries. And the issue with this kind of world is that it's usually won between great powers, let's say the US and China, and everyone else is basically a middle power, which has to decide in this bipolarity between the US and China where you sit. You don't really have agency. You don't have sovereignty in the classic sense. You don't really have economic independence unless you choose to withdraw from the world economy, like, say, North Korea or potentially Iran. Everyone else has to reckon with the new world where everything is sort of up for grabs. Their supply chains are not solid. We are closing borders to trade and we're closing borders to migrants. And we're seeing, economics is basically just another phase of war. And I think that's actually the settled arrangement. I don't think that's going to change. We're just returning back to the world, which we forgot about, which existed before free trade and globalization. and it's a world of extraction, it's a world of imperialism, and it's a world of great power rivalry. So I think in some senses, I don't feel so, I'm not very cautious about the fact that I'm basically calling it. I think that paradigm is done.
Assalamu alaikum, Sister Linda Sarsoor. I'm here from New York in the Wajir camp here in Kenya. We are at an eye clinic that is supported by Beit al-Mal. Today, there are at least 100 surgeries for cataracts that are being done on adults over the age of 18. These are people that have lost sight in either one eye or both eyes. They are getting surgeries paid for by the donors of Beit al-Mal. I was able to witness a surgery and watch a woman 65 years of age get up and say, even through the bandage on her eye, she was able to see the light. Sisters and brothers, it's about $120 US dollars to give somebody back the gift of sight. We take it for granted. The surgery happens and the next day they wake up and they're able to see, sisters and brothers. So please make your donation to Beit al-Mal. Decide how many people you want to save. How many eyes do you want to save? How much light do you want to bring back into people's lives? $120 is for one eye and to save people from cataracts, which is unfortunately something that is impacting a majority of the community here in the Wajir camp. So assalamu alaikum, and thank you so much, and may Allah bless you for all you've done already for Beit al-Mal and continue to do.
Visit btml.us/thinkingmuslim to learn more and give.
Wow, so this is now a world of great power, of accumulation of power. This is a world where geography matters and control over bits of geography really does matter. So are we seeing then, is it, this dream of liberalization, this dream of comparative advantage, has that disappeared? Has that gone now? Are we now, at a different phase of international politics?
I think so. Basically, you just look around the world and who are the defenders of free trade? There's very, very few.
China?
China notionally will pay lip service to the idea that it wants free trade. That's because China has benefited massively from the global trading system that it entered. Yeah. And a cynical view of how the Chinese operate is that they use the world's free trading system to bend its rules, ultimately to create massive dependencies. I mean, there is a view of China, which is that ultimately, what do the Chinese want? And the truth is they don't want anything from us. They really don't. They strive to be an autarkic power in the sense that they want to make everything in China. They want to have economic relationships with countries that provide them with the commodities so they can make everything in China, and then they sell us those things. Now, there is a benign version of that, which is great. They sell us cheap things. They oversupply. They have overcapacity. They are super industrialized, and we get to benefit. And I'll talk about some of the countries that will benefit, in particular Pakistan, when it comes to solar technology. But then there's the cynical version of that, is that once you have got into bed with China because they're basically running your entire energy grid, there's also a trade-off involved because they could switch it off or they have malign intentions. And we saw the weaponization that China did in response to Trump about 6 months ago, which was that, I'm actually talking to you near the anniversary of Liberation Day on April the 2nd, which was supposed to be the cataclysmic event for the global economy. Turned out it wasn't. I think this one probably might be. But that was the moment where the US, which is used to bullying countries through its financial might, realized there was one country it couldn't really bully, which was China, because China had all of the cards in that arrangement. And China turned it back on everyone else and said, well, every single metal and every single raw material and commodity that basically every country in the world needs somehow goes through a Chinese supply chain. And we can make your life very, very difficult if you don't back down on the tariffs. And guess what? Donald Trump did back down. So, China will pay lip service to the idea of what it wants is stability. What it likes is stability. I don't think it enjoys the fact that there is conflict and war, because so many of the countries it invests in are being caught up in these difficulties. But the idea that they are a liberal free trading nation that want to do mutual exchange is just really not borne out by the fact that they have the largest trade surplus of any country in history at $1 trillion. And if you think about the pronouncements of Xi Jinping, he has no, compulsion to change that. And it's just a question of whether or not we trust China to be a reliable partner or whether it can turn on us in a way that Trump just has.
Now, can I ask you about the Gulf Arab states? These governments have positioned themselves as bastions of stability in an otherwise really troubled region. What does this past month tell us about their vulnerabilities?
Yeah, I think it's worth actually not talking about the Gulf as a whole in this sense. I think it's worth just talking about them individually because their
Yes.
economic profiles are quite different.
Right.
Let's start with Qatar, the smallest of the lot. Qatar is effectively a city-state around Doha. It has a population of 2.5 million people. It's small. It is entirely dependent on LNG for its government revenues. 85% of its exports are gas. It is an incredibly important strategic position by the Strait. It shares the world's largest natural gas field with Iran. It's the only country that operationalizes that gas field because the Iranians don't have access to it. Qatar has become an important geopolitical player, particularly after 2022, when its LNG became the life raft for so many advanced economies. And I think it's positioned itself, and I know other guests have spoken about it, as a mediator and a country that uses its resources to help out the rest of the world. And also it wants to be a diplomatic player. The interesting thing about Qatar is that when it sells LNG to the rest of the world, it does it in a very specific way, which is really long-term contracts with stable prices. And that's very attractive to Asia. So the Asian market is effectively where most of Qatar's LNG goes. Then we have the UAE, which is different. The UAE has a population of 11 million. It's much bigger. That population, at least of expats, is concentrated in Dubai, about 4 to 5 million, rising to 6 and 7 over the next couple of years, if you believe their trajectory. Then there's Abu Dhabi, which is the capital, which is kind of the oil power. And the kind of arrangement has been that Abu Dhabi is the center of political power. It's also the energy power. But basically, the UAE has diversified its economy. It is no longer just reliant on oil and gas revenues to make its economy work. And they have very much positioned themselves as, I would say, a global entrepot for goods, services, and people. They are an aviation hub, they are a capital hub, they are a financial center, the UAE, and they are a hub for tourism. So they are the most touristic reliance economy in the GCC as a percentage of their GDP. They rely people to come spend money there and to live there. So it is diversified. And then there's Saudi, which is a completely different player because there are more than 40 million people in Saudi Arabia. And up until very recently, it was the least diversified economy in the entire world. I think in 2020, on any measure of diversification, it was only reliant on oil. Oil was responsible for close as possible to 100% of revenues, of GDP, of economic activity was coming from oil. And over the last few years, they've had something called Vision 2030, which was the process or the slower process of diversifying the Saudi economy to be less oil reliant. And that means basically creating a domestic economy. That means having infrastructure at home, having Saudis spend money at home, building roads, rails, having real cities, rebalancing the economy just from being an oil power to being a conventional domestic economy. It's also much larger. And people in Saudi, the 40 million, are majority Saudis. They're not foreigners. So those are three very different economic profiles. They all have different degrees of vulnerability. It's clear, I think the smaller you are, like Qatar and the UAE, that makes you vulnerable. And the other thing to ask, the only thing that brings, I think, these countries together is they sit on incredible, deep wells of capital, which are represented by their sovereign wealth funds. So with the exception of Norway, the GCC and the Saudis have the largest sovereign wealth funds in the world. The UAE, by some estimate, is close to $3 trillion. The Saudis over $1 trillion. The Qataris about $500 billion. The region as a whole has about $6 trillion of wealth captured by their sovereign wealth funds, which is basically state money that they have saved through the years of selling oil to the rest of the world. And this makes them economically very important actors in global capital and the financial system because of where this money has been going. And we can talk about the petrodollar system, but that is effectively a system that was created in the Middle East. It was actually created in Saudi Arabia in 1974, where after the oil embargo, in return for US security guarantees, the Saudis decided, and they made a very important decision, they would sell their oil, they would sell it in US dollars. That's why every time we quote a price for WTI or Brent crude, we do it in US dollars. Yeah. Even if the US isn't selling it and it's not going to US customers. Yeah. The dollar is the denomination, it is the invoicing currency for oil. And the arrangement was that the Saudis would sell oil in dollars, they would accumulate dollars, and you can't spend dollars in Saudi Arabia. What do you do with dollars? You put them in dollar assets. Yeah. And the flow of money was basically from those states into US assets. Traditionally, it was government bonds, but now it's in every single high growth sector of the United States, which is basically the equities, AI, the tech sector, private credit, real estate, everything that we will talk about. So this money then gets recycled back into the US economy, which has been the dominant economy for the last half a century, which in the last 15 years has been outperforming Europe. It's not outperforming China, but it's a very strong, resilient economy, partly because of this relationship with what the rest of the world does with its dollars. So those are three different economic models. I think the smaller you are, the more vulnerable you are. And I would say of the three, I think the UAE is probably the most vulnerable, ironically, even though it's done the most diversification, quote unquote.
And why is that?
Because I think the UAE, strategically, we know has had very clear aims in terms of how it wants to behave as a geopolitical actor, but how its economic model is going to marry into how it also behaves as a geopolitical actor. And those two things are symbiotic. And the truth is that the UAE wants to be and has been a global transit area for, as I said, commodities, capital, aviation, people, gold, and often in nefarious ways. So I know you've had other guests talking about the role that they play in basically the shadow transit of goods. It is not just a hub for American or Western capital, also for Russian capital, also for the Iranians, it's been very important. And also for all of the kind of countries in which the UAE has sort of been fomenting secessionist tendencies. A lot of those militia forces can use the UAE basically as a laundering hub for weapons and gold and to access money and capital. Now, I think it's a good strategy not to be an oil-reliant country, but the bet was made on the world economy looking a certain way. And it was kind of reliant on what you said. There's a kind of liberal world order where there is the free flow of people, capital, and goods. And if you make yourself into a global financial center, that means you're basically reliant on inflows of people. You're reliant on your role to have inflows of capital. There's nowhere else that capital is going to go. You've also got a lot of capital, which is going from the Middle East out into the rest of the world, which makes you important for other countries because you create economic partnerships with them. Now, that world is actually probably disappearing faster than anyone in the UAE might have imagined, which is why I think that the attempt at resilience is actually going to become a vulnerability, because all of a sudden the flows of people and capital and goods can also just stop in wartime situations, in situations where your airborne security is not guaranteed, where flights, it's easy for flights to just take ways around, but it's less easy for goods to do that. You're exposed to a recalcitrant power like the Iranians in your region. And you also made another bet, which is on the Israelis, who maybe are geopolitically helpful for you, but I don't see any economic benefits that the UAE is getting from that particular arrangement, despite whatever apart from the fact that it gets audiences in the White House, which is important. So I think the vulnerability is that I'm not saying that this is the end of the UAE. I actually think that really that would be a silly thing to call. But you do have to question all of the assumptions on which they built their economic and their geopolitical model, which are the same things, the kind of actor that they want to be. A lot of those assumptions are now much more up for grabs. And part of the economic rivalry in the region was that, the Saudis are at a lower stage of development than the UAE, but they saw the UAE as the model, the diversified model. And part of the tension was that they were fighting over the same things. They were fighting over the multinational companies, where should they be based. If you're a management consultant, you want to, the Saudis are hiring you to build their projects, but you want to live in Abu Dhabi or Dubai because it's nicer. But the Saudis are like, no, you need to domicile in Riyadh and Jeddah. If you want to be here, you want to be here. So there was competition between the countries. And now I think the UAE model, in many ways, is got a much bigger question mark over it. Now, everything I've said is kind of caveated by the fact that we don't really know what's happening in the UAE. We know that they've made investments in some areas. We know some of those investments are basically in big Western liquid financial markets, but we don't really know their exposures financially. We don't really know how many people have left. We don't know how many people are coming back. The interesting thing about being a hub for people to come and want to live in, for global capital, is that people who have lots of capital can go wherever they want. Yeah. They're not necessarily going to be rooted or loyal to you. They'll just go to the next place that offers them the better tax incentives or the business opportunities. So there is a kind of flightiness about the whole model. And I think that's the thing that people are now asking much deeper questions about, the flightiness.
And Mehreen, this past month has really shown us that energy really does matter for the global economy, and access to energy and supply chains really do matter. Why do you think on Gaza, the Arab states, those Gulf states, really didn't use energy as a leverage point, as they did back in 1973.
Yeah, so you're asking me why, in 1973, most of your listeners probably wouldn't have remembered what happened, but the OPEC countries led by Saudi Arabia protested against US support for Israel in the Yom Kippur War by restricting energy supplies. And importantly, that was an arrangement that was done by the Saudis, OPEC, and the Shah of Iran at the time. So there was a consensus that they were going to hit back. And what happened in the West was they created the worst inflationary crisis since the Great Depression. So throughout the 1970s, basically not until the mid-1980s had inflation been vanquished as a force in the United States and the UK and countries like Italy, where inflation was in double digits. And they had to do that by basically throwing their countries into recessions. So these were incredibly painful moments for Western economies, and one that it took more than a decade for them to get over. So every time people talk about inflation, they always refer back to the 70s. This is why. Because actually those countries, the Middle East countries, played a very important role in saying, we are not happy with the role that you're playing. We're not happy with Israel, so we're gonna make you hurt. They've never done it since. They've never even come close since. And I was thinking about why. And I went back and thought about what was going on in the 70s. And a figure that is now, I think, being mentioned a lot more in the popular discourse because of what the Iranians have done is someone called Sheikh Ahmed Yamani, who was the energy minister in Saudi Arabia who initiated the boycott. He was the face of the oil embargo. If you were around in the 1970s, you saw this guy who was talking to the West about how they're going to be punished. And he's an incredibly interesting figure, and I would encourage all of your listeners to go and look into him. He was the son of a Qadi. He was born in Mecca to an incredibly pious family. He himself seemed to be an incredibly pious man. As a commoner, he ended up going to Harvard, became a fantastic lawyer and a diplomat, and then caught the eye of King Faisal, who made him energy minister in the late 1960s. And Sheikh Yamani is now a legendary figure in oil diplomacy because he instigated the oil embargo very carefully with partners like the Iranians. There were some that wanted a harsher embargo, some that wanted less. But ultimately, at that time, Saudi Arabia was an oil player, but it actually hadn't discovered the degrees of oil reserves that they subsequently did. And now Saudi is an oil superpower. In the 1970s, they were a middling superpower. And Sheikh Yamani speaks very, he had an incredible diplomatic tact, because what happened was that the Saudis do the embargo with other Arab countries. There is also unity among the Arab countries. So let's start with that. We don't have that today. So the conditions are very different. And after the embargo, which is incredibly successful because Audi saw Audi oil revenues triple in the process of 3 months, they imposed incredible pain on Western economies. And effectively, they do win in the sense that they get the Israelis to back down. And after that process, he then goes on to basically take full control of Saudi oil from American West oil companies. Saudi Aramco is born. And the modern superpower that is Saudi Arabia, oil superpower, happens through his diplomatic efforts. And I'm not just mentioning him because, one, he's a completely totemic figure. And to answer your question, why is it not happening now? Yeah. Because we don't have people like him around, effectively. If you look at the state of Arab political elites, do we have these types of figures who I would say Sheikh Yamani had a moral imperative? He spoke very powerfully about the fact that Saudi Arabia has oil, but the oil will go and the only thing that will stay is Islam. The only thing that's important about us is that we are the custodians of our holy sites. He created a modern energy superpower. He survived an assassination attempt at an OPEC meeting. A Venezuelan called Carlos the Assassin tried to kill him. He saw the assassination of King Faisal as well. He lived in this incredibly long life, died at the age of 90. And I do wonder what he would think now about the state of the Gulf countries and the Arab countries who are just unable or unwilling to band together, have a unified sense of purpose to say that we want to defend Palestinians, or that we are ready to use our incredible resources, which God has gifted us with, which we are custodians of, our oil and gas wealth, to say that no means no. Now, none of those conditions exist, of course. Yeah. And let's not kid ourselves. Before October the 7th, the UAE and Bahrain had already signed the Abraham Accords. The Saudis had not signed them, but there was a process in trail where eventually they would have made an arrangement where they become trade and commercial partners with Israel. These are not the conditions in which they would then just turn around and say, by the way, we're going to enforce maximum pain on you for what's happening to the Palestinians. And there is a kind of spiritual dimension to it and also geopolitical dimension. If we think about everything that is happening right now in Iran, it's very difficult for me to not think of this as blowback from what happened in Gaza in every single way. And my friend Mehreen Khan, who writes for The Guardian, wrote a fantastic column a couple of weeks about how this is all revenge for our complicity, our acquiescence in the atrocities in Gaza, our inability as Muslim countries and Arab countries to stand up. And we are paying the price because ultimately, if we thought that you can enact a degree of, I think, wanton violence and unaccountability on those people, that it was never going to come back to hurt any of us. Or any other country in the region, that we would be able to put a lid on this and that would be it. I mean, all of the events that have happened in Iran, to me, you can really just date them back to October 7th and how we reacted to it. And so actually the Arab countries haven't done the extreme option, but the country that has triggered it is the Iranians. They are doing the 1973 version by making the rest of the world pay for the attack that they've suffered. They have triggered that nuclear option by themselves bilaterally. And it actually, even without having the concert or the agreement of its fellow Arab countries, has been incredibly powerful. So they have basically acted. I wouldn't say they've acted in the way that Sheikh Yamani did, because his whole thing was to get consensus and to make sure that they were doing this in the correct way. Yeah. But the Iranians have ultimately used the leverage that we all knew they had.
I mean, do you see any signs of the Muslim world, and particularly the Arab world, of the Gulf states banding together at any time soon? I mean, we did see a meeting of the quartet in Islamabad recently, and I will come to Pakistan and its predicament in terms of energy in a second. But there is a conversation about diversification, about moving away from American security guarantees, be that Russian or Chinese or even European. I think MBS yesterday signed an agreement with Ukraine, and there was some conversation about how that was done despite American sort of guarantees. It was done behind America's back. There is this hopeful, maybe optimistic, maybe too optimistic conversation about how this is, this last month has taught these Gulf states a bitter lesson about putting your eggs in one basket and just being too interconnected with the United States and the need to move beyond that paradigm.
I think geopolitically that's clearly true. So you even saw it when the Saudis basically signed a defense pact with Pakistan to effectively be covered by their nuclear umbrella. Yeah. That happened a year ago. Geopolitically, it's never smart to put your eggs in one basket, and you can find other trade partners to provide you with weapons. You can realize that F-35s are not reliable because they can just be switched off at the drop of a hat. So, but economically, what does it mean to be diversified? Yeah. In a dollarized world economy with an interconnected financial system where you have small populations and you're relying on things like capital flows and people flows? That's much harder for me to think about. Having said that, the obvious alternative, and the one that has been there for a long time, is China, and is actually one that the Arab countries before this war were much more willing to entertain. The UAE sees the way that China runs its kind of state-controlled economy through state enterprises, massive amounts of public investment to build industries, as a model for how the UAE should behave. The Saudis have been doing green energy partnerships with China. So in some senses, this slow-moving sense in which we're not going to put all of our eggs in one basket has already happened. I think Trump 1 was the trigger. And despite the fact that you saw, I think somebody called them the least successful bribes in history, which is the Qataris buying Air Force One for Trump, yes, and the Emiratis pumping hundreds of millions of pounds into World Liberty Financial, which is basically the crypto holding company set up by Trump's family and his friends to basically win over this president who's incredibly capricious and entirely dominant. I think, he's entirely motivated by material and financial motives. Let's be very clear about it. He wants to get very, very rich, and they offered him lots of money. They were unsuccessful in that, and I think, were they the least successful bribes in history? Potentially, but I think they weren't just thinking that giving Trump bungs was going to work. We can talk about what it means to be part of a dollarized financial economy a bit later, but the reality is that the reliability of the dollar, of the petrodollar system, as we spoke about, and what I think is the element that we haven't really explored, which is what happens if there is deep actual financial instability. So many of these countries spend their incredible wealth outside of their countries. They spend it making investments, which make the West go round, which makes the S&P 500 and the Mag 7 have eye-watering valuations. So much of that money leaves the country. But what happens if these countries have true war damage? They have to reconstruct themselves. They promised a lot of money to Gaza. So much of Gaza's reconstruction was going to come from the wealth of the neighboring countries, the generosity of them. When that money's not there anymore, what does it mean? The UAE, part of its financial relationships with weaker dependent countries is that it gives them loans. And it gives them loans to tie them into political relationship, but it does give them money. And these are some of the poorest countries in the world that rely on the kind of credit lifelines of the Saudis, the UAE, and Qatar to some extent. If that money is now not going to be leaving its shores, it needs to stay where it is. It just has financial implications for the rest of us. So I think the early stages that how do they consolidate what they think about is their wealth. And then the secondary question about diversification is going to be happening in the background. I mean, the interesting thing about Trump is that he doesn't seem to care so much. Like, he was very annoyed at the BRICS for, having the temerity to come up with a BRICS currency, and he hated the idea of it. But if he doesn't really know about it or he doesn't really understand it, he's not out here telling the Saudis or the Emiratis that they can't get into bed with the Chinese or they can't be buying green technology. He doesn't seem to have so much of a kind of protective instinct. Partly, if we believe his vision of the world, he's like, well, my hemisphere is in the West and in the North, and I'll let everything else, east of, I don't know, Europe, maybe even Europe doesn't even count into this. Maybe just, east of Ireland is another hemisphere, and I'll let, the Chinese or other people just work out their arrangements for themselves. So he may have a more limited ambition for the extra juridical importance of the United States with its former vassal countries.
And the predictions that we get all the time, but the prediction that we're moving away from a dollarized economy and oil producers, big oil producers like Saudi and Iran are moving to trade in oil, not using the dollar, but using the yuan or other such currencies. I mean, how from your perspective, like, how accurate do you think that is in sort of near to medium term?
So I think this story started in 2022, and I think the sanctioning of Russia, so the United States with the European countries decided that it was going to impose some of the most stringent financial sanctions on anyone doing any business with Russia, started this in train. And we know this because everyone started to buy gold. And the reason that countries, sovereigns, central banks bought gold was because they needed to recycle so much of their reserves. And instead of holding that money in dollars, they were going to hold it in gold. What the Chinese did was they were also going to hold it in oil. So what they decided to do is that you don't want to be sitting on a stockpile of dollars. Actually, we need reserves of commodities in emergency situations. So we know that the Chinese, probably since the 12-Day War and probably prior, realized that they needed stockpiles of oil. By some measure, they have reserves that are going into 6 to 9 months to run their industrialized economies, which shows the degree to which the nerves about how to manage your economy domestically in a world where the US is no longer a reliable partner has been a question that some countries have been much further apart. I think the Chinese have done most in the direction of their resilience. So it's already a story that's been happening. It's probably been happening since the start of the decade. And, I'm quite sympathetic to arguments that you don't need a reserve currency in the world. Like, why is the dollar the reserve currency? Because it's basically the currency we all save in. And it's the currency that countries save in, so they hold stockpiles of dollars. Yep. It's also the currency that, say, for example, the US has played a role where if other people in the world need dollars in an emergency situation, it provides you with those dollars. It gives you that kind of liquidity. Its central bank has swap lines where it will offer the Bank of England, the ECB, Japan, Mexico, emergency dollars if they're having financial issues and their banks can't get hold of dollars. They've played a very benevolent role in being able to give us their currency because we need it, and it's also a currency of invoice. Now, the Chinese have been doing exactly the same thing. Like, unbeknownst to the US, the Chinese is developing swap lines in yuan and renminbi with all of the countries in the region in Southeast Asia. So you can now, if you're Indonesia, access yuan or renminbi and do a swap between the two currencies, and the dollar doesn't need to be involved. And the importance of the dollar as reserve currency is that almost every single financial transaction between two currencies has to be done in the dollar first. If I want to give you pounds for Swiss francs, we'd probably have to transact in the dollar first and then get it to the secondary currency, which makes it basically the oil that makes the financial system go around. The world's reserve asset is the US government bond. Why do you want to hold US government bonds? Because effectively you can sell it and buy anything with it. You can buy gold, you can buy commodities. That's the bet that you made when you held the US Treasury bond. That's no longer going to be a certainty anymore. And I think we already see there is a declining share of the rest of the world holding dollars. It's not happening fast. It will not happen fast. And the dollar is the reserve currency, but there are also other reserve currencies. And I think we're already seeing the Europeans who understand that they just don't pull their weight in this debate. They're moving to things like central bank digital currencies. They want to be able to offer euros to other people. They want to invoice the buying of oil and gas, particularly from countries like Norway, in euros, just to make the euro a currency that kind of steps up and can offer safety to people who are a bit more squeamish about holding dollars. So I think the dollar story is a slow-moving one. I don't think it's going to happen overnight. I don't think you lose your reserve currency status overnight. But the trust factor, well, I think the kind of complacency we all had about dollar assets is basically going away.
And so let's, when we talk about the Muslim world, we've looked at the Gulf states, and these are heavily reliant on exports of energy, and they've got massive supplies of energy. But of course, a lot of the Muslim world isn't like that. Pakistan, Bangladesh, you've got countries that are wholly reliant on energy imports. I mean, how are these countries faring in the current crisis?
Yeah, these are the countries that I think that are at the sharp end of any kind of global commodities crisis, which involves the commodities being food and oil, or food and energy, let's put it that way, because they are entirely dependent on imports. They do not have any of the natural resources that can satisfy their domestic consumption.
Yeah.
And we also, again, saw this in 2022 when there was a fertilizer panic, a crisis in global food markets with grains, because Ukraine was basically the breadbasket of the world. Yeah. And so many of these economies were completely imperiled. We saw in Sri Lanka, the government was overthrown. They had a coup. People were upset because they couldn't afford to live anymore. Pakistan's LNG reliance was so bad that there was a situation in which ships that were destined from Qatar to Pakistan were... I mean, the interesting thing about LNG is it's not like oil, which goes through pipelines. LNG sits on ships. And if you just want to pay a bit more, you get the ship to come to you. And that's what the Europeans did. I mean, the degree of the crisis was so bad that effectively Pakistan went bankrupt. It had to go into an IMF bailout. The politics of the country then were in complete turmoil. India relies on LNG for most of its cooking needs. So you're seeing people queuing in places like India and Nepal for gas canisters that people just need to make bread and to eat every single day. And I mentioned the richer countries like South Korea and Japan. The truth is those countries, it's difficult, but they can afford it. They can just pay more, and they will pay more. Right. This is not true of the middle income countries or the lower income countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh and India. So there's two elements to the story of their exposure. One is global commodities and energy. And the other one that I think isn't talked about too much is remittances. So the Gulf is a massive source. The Gulf has massive migrant labor. It comes predominantly from a few countries: India, Pakistan, the Philippines, Egypt. They have people, laborers, who send money back home. Remittances. To some degree, there are tens and billions of dollars that go back from the GCC countries back to their home countries. The highest proportion, I think, is Egypt, Pakistan, and Jordan, where more than 7 to 8% of national GDP comes from people who have jobs, who work in those regions, who send money back. And the reason that's important is that money then goes back, it stabilizes the domestic currencies, and it creates a kind of some degree of stability because money is flowing into the country from outside the country. Now, if that migrant labor suddenly comes under question because those people that no longer have jobs, because the economics of the countries are much more difficult, or they have to come home, that's one massive fiscal pressure that is concentrated in the GCC countries. And then there's the energy question. Now, I think Pakistan is a very important case because they suffered so much in 2022 and they made a decision that they didn't want to be in the position again. So what did they do? Pakistan has had probably the most significant energy transformation in terms of the transition to solar power in its grid in the last 5 years of any country. Really? And what it's basically done is realized that China, which overproduces and has excess capacity of cheap solar panels, they are all coming to Pakistan, and they are going to be an essential feature of the Pakistani grid. So I think by the end of this year, 20% of Pakistani's domestic energy needs will be supplied by solar photovoltaic panels. If you see pictures of anywhere in Pakistan, you just see everyone has a solar panel. They kind of cover the roofs of buildings and houses in the country. And they made a bet to say that we can't be in a position where we just have LNG. I mean, they are suffering still right now. I mean, 20% of your energy needs supplied by solar is good, but it still means there's an 80% reliance on hydrocarbons. And that means people are going to start burning coal again. And that means they're going to try and get diesel, anything to just produce electricity. But that is an example of when you're in an extreme situation, you're forced to make a decision and to do a transition of this kind, which wouldn't have happened if it wasn't in the most extreme circumstances. Now, the question is it a good idea to have the Chinese running your electricity grid? Well, it's very cheap. You're completely independent because there's lots of sun. It's a hot country. So there's no way it can be switched off per se. And you're saving, by some degree, billions and billions of dollars by weaning yourself off hydrocarbons that are coming from a part of the world that you can't rely on, which is Qatar and LNG anymore. So the geopolitics of energy are very, very interesting because you have China as this massive global renewable power, which is just willing to give everyone green energy at cost, maybe even below cost prices, to turn themselves into independent renewable powers. And I think the implications of that for the dollar, for the petrodollar, for US hegemony, if we're all defense independent and security independent and energy independent, why does anyone need to transact in the dollar anymore?
And do you think we can get to a world where that becomes a reality using using solar panels and other forms of environmental?
It won't work for everyone. Not everyone's Pakistan. You don't have the solar. Exactly. In this country, we have wind. And we're trying to make the best of it. But there are other problems with the grid and expensive and how we price energy. But for a country like Pakistan or countries in the global south, yes, that is going to be the only game in town. And you will bite someone's hand off for it. Because ultimately, for your population, which is some of the youngest in the world, but also the poorest in the world, the provision of energy, not having blackouts, being able to just run an economy, which is they're not particularly industrialized, but to have a reliable source of energy in this kind of world, yeah, of course. I mean, we do it in Britain. We're constantly talking about energy security. We're always talking about the North Sea and just keep mining it and keep mining it. At some point, it is going to exhaust itself. So energy independence for most countries looks like renewables. And there's only really one player in the game that is offering you the opportunity to do that very cheaply and very reliably, and that's China. And that's the kind of medium to long-term play, which I don't think people like Donald Trump really understand about what it means to cut countries off from the Strait of Hormuz. They will have to find something else. And the something else is not, as he says, just buy American oil. It's not going to be an American oil. It's not going to be American LNG. It's more likely going to be renewable. So I think in that sense, China can be quietly watching because it's probably going to have a lot more customers for what it's trying to sell.
Brilliant. Can I ask you about Iran? I mean, Iran has lived under pretty punitive economic sanctions for a good number of years. I mean, do you feel that, in a sense, it can weather this sort of coming storm better than other countries just because it's lived under these sort of sanctions regime for quite a long time?
Yeah, more than a decade. If you think that the JCPOA, which is the nuclear deal, which was ripped up by Trump in 2016, from then on, they've been living under much harsher sanctions. I mean, there's just a kind of truth in the fact that I think necessity is the mother of invention. That when you are cut off from global supply chains, when you can no longer rely on being a full-blown player in the world economy, you have to find your own ways. We saw this with China about a year ago when they launched DeepSeek. Despite not having access to the world's most advanced chip technology, they managed to come up with a LLM, an AI system that was running as well as anyone using ChatGPT on much more energy efficiency and was incredibly cheaper because they just had to make do with what they had. And sanctions, I think, are really important philosophically. Why do we put sanctions on countries? What are they supposed to achieve? And are they achieving what they're supposed to achieve? Sanctions have now become a normal part of, I think, geopolitics and statecraft. Russia's probably the best example of the fact that we tried to, and we did put Russia under incredible financial sanctions. Did it hurt the Russian economy? Yes. Did it imperil the Russian economy? No. Because Russia found customers for its wares in Asia. It developed relationships with countries that are outside of the US orbit. And there was a lot of rerouting of trade. Effectively, Russia's economy became a war economy, but it sort of survived. And the Iranians are also a good example of what is the point of the sanctions? Is it to punish the populations? To say, well, if you keep this government intact, we will, cut you off from global supply chains so you can't get iPhones and you can't get Coca-Cola and you can't eat well? Or is it what we used to think was that we apply sanctions because we don't want to go to war? So actually the reason that you're going to be suffering financial consequences is because we don't want to invade your country, we don't want to do the regime change, and this is a way to prevent full-blown war. Now we do both. We do the sanctions, and then we also do the military or the kinetic options, which makes me philosophically think that what's the point of the strategy of a sanction which was supposed to get us back from the brink? One, they don't work. And two, what they actually do is force countries under extreme pressure to find alternatives. And in this world, there are alternatives. There are other games in town, and China's one that I've already mentioned. So I think philosophically, people that are traditionally, pro-sanctions, which is like liberals or Democrats in the US, or, progressives that are kind of anti-war, let's just sanction the country. You have to really think about the long-term implications, but because you may just be creating these very resilient monsters, which then you have to go to war with to achieve the aims that the sanctions didn't do. And then I think there's moral questions about, basically collective punishment through sanctions. But I think the whole sanctions philosophy is kind of falling apart. The whole raison d'etre for sanctions seems to have just failed on every metric of success, of strategy, of purpose. They don't seem to work. Iran is just the latest case of a country in which sanctions are nice in principle, but what have they really done?
So moving forward, we've talked about the Muslim world and some of the vulnerabilities that exist in the Muslim world of Gulf states, those states that are wholly dependent on energy imports and how they may be diversifying, like Pakistan. But the last time we had a conversation, we tried to strike a little bit of a hopeful note about the future. Like if, for example, we did have the Saudi energy minister, I forget his name, but if we did have Sheikh Yamani, if we did have good quality politicians and statesmen and women in the Muslim world who looked at this current crisis and learned lessons from the crisis economically, what should they be doing?
Yeah, I think in the sense that, characters like Sheikh Yamani don't come out of nowhere. Mm-hmm. And if we are going to breed a new generation of political and business elites in this environment, they are going to be far less complacent about the state of the world than anyone that was born in the times of the end of history, or when the Saudis were a global superpower, for example. I think, let me say this in a generous way, some of the developments economically, geoeconomically, that were happening in the Gulf were examples of overreach and hubris. Yeah. And if that hubris has now come back to bite people, I would welcome that. So I think, there are very few rules in kind of foreign policy, but I think if you mess around with other countries and not expect any of the boomerang to come back to you, you're being incredibly naive. So much, I think, of the ferment that has been sowed by countries like the UAE and the rest of the world is now coming to its shores. And if that can be an example, like a kind of chastening moment for people to realize that there are consequences for their actions of what they do in other countries, and it kind of brings a degree of modesty to their own economic and geo-economic ambitions, I think that's welcome. One star, so that's some degree of optimism. And then I think secondarily, the scales are kind of falling from people's eyes. I think the difficulty about moving from one regime to another is the transition is always very difficult. And even though I describe we're living in a mercantilist world, the truth is we're living from some degree of unipolarity to now thinking about how to hedge your bets geopolitically. Who are your allies? Do you have any allies? Is it a thing to have an ally now, or is anyone just a potential kind of convenient partner for a particular thing, and then you have to realize that you need counterbalances and hedges in other countries economically. There is a lot of wealth in that region, and that wealth comes from natural abundance. Yeah. And if we're going to think Islamically, this is something that we are custodians of. We don't own this. There is not a natural right to have levels of resources like this. It is a gift, and how you manage it is basically a reflection of who you are. I think the chasing of extreme amounts of material wealth, I was thinking the other day, it wasn't that long ago that MBS bought EA Sports, right? Because he likes paying FIFA. Yeah. And he paid tens of millions of dollars to have this. If some of that incredible, I think, waste and profligacy now stops, I think that's good for everyone. I think spiritually it's good, and it basically was effectively setting money on fire. So let's stop doing that. I think there has to be some kind of realization about what security really is, how you need to pay for security, and how you need to provide things for domestic citizens and provision. Because ultimately, let's be honest, these countries we're talking about, they are all monarchies. The only thing that really motivates them is existentially their own survival. And that requires on giving your population certain degrees of certainties about what life is going to like if they're going to keep living under these arrangements. So I think in that sense, I am quite optimistic that the hubris has been shown up and there's going to be a pullback. there is a little bit that I'm less optimistic about, and I just want to kind of throw it out there that when we talk about these economies, we're not just talking about them in isolation anymore, because they are basically global players, and the decisions they make will affect us in the rest of the world. And this is definitely true of the UAE, which is basically a financial center in the way that New York and London are financial centers. And when things happen in financial centers, as in they're caught up in wars and conflicts, the implications of that basically can reverberate through the financial system, which we're all connected through by money, banks, shadow banks, private equity, etc. And I just want to throw out there that the UAE, we know they've made huge investments in some of the fastest growing sectors of the world economy, AI, software, private credit. Before this war, those were sectors that there was lots of nerves around valuations in software. When Claude launched, people realized that all software companies basically don't need to exist because we have Claude. Private credit is an area where lending is done outside of the banking system. It's basically between insurers, asset managers, and private equity. This was a very sort of hairy area where we're getting a lot of fraud, and we're getting some examples of companies going bust. Real estate, anyone that you've talked to in Dubai would tell you that the real estate market is completely insane and it's going nuts. If money withdraws from these sectors and you have bubbles, it will have an impact in things that we just don't know about. Like there will be connections to financial, your pension, my insurance company, your housing prices. There are so many interlinkages, and this is the kind of opacity and I think the difficulty about the financial system is that so things that happen in financial centers like the UAE are not just matters for the UAE or for the region. They will matter for us. Now, what we need to do is probably just pray that they handle them well, that they have an ability to manage them well. People say that say what you want about the government. They're effectively good governments. They run their countries very well. They're strategic. They make decisions, centralized decisions that are good for their people. Let's hope that that kind of benevolence sort of kicks in. If indeed we end up in, I think, financial instability territory where the instability is actually in the Middle East, because that is very untested. These countries have been through a lot. They've never been at the epicenter of a financial crisis. And that will be a test of their own mettle, which is not an optimistic way to end. But I think, my optimism is that the naivety and complacency about who your friends and enemies are is no longer going to be accepted. It's not going to be accepted in the geopolitical realm, and neither is it going to be true in economics.
But then what is the potential of the Muslim world? Like if we did have the right people in place and we had the right thinking, because of course a lot of the time, when Muslims come together and talk about the Muslim world, we can only be, pessimistic about our future, and Gaza and other sort of flashpoints have taught us that things just don't seem to move, even though we have the ability to move, to leverage our power and our ability and our expertise, but we just don't quite get there. If we did have the right people in place economically, how successful could I'm talking about the greater Muslim world, how successful could that world be?
Well, in terms of sheer force of numbers, I've been spending a lot of time thinking about early Islamic economic civilization and what it was. It was basically a trading empire that spread from some point the south of Spain all the way to the Indonesian archipelago. I would argue that Islam invented commercial capitalism as we know it. I would argue that Islam invented everything that we now call free trade and globalization, because it created a unit, a zone, the Dar al-Islam, which was not just Muslims doing it. It was anyone living in those lands were able to benefit from Islamic security of private property, the fact that you could carry a caravan and hold gold and you'd be protected from one way station to another, the garrison towns, urban civilization. All of the riches that came to early Islamic civilization was because we had an onus on the importance of exchange and trade. Now, so how do you think about it? It's like the European Union single market, but in the medieval European times, done by a civilization that nobody had ever heard of. These Muslims, they'd come out of nowhere, and they were just getting incredibly rich and wealthy and accumulating labor and capital because their territories were expanding at absolutely breakneck pace. And they were doing things like creating economic institutions. They were doing things with the wealth. The wealth was being used to provide for the poor, to give security to private property. Islam was the civilization that reintroduced coinage to Europe. The dirham was a solid gold-backed currency, which was used as a mechanism for exchange that you could trust, while the Europeans were still bartering, right? We are a center and have been the hub of financial innovation for good, because we understood that this is a moral enterprise to earn a good livelihood, to amass wealth for the poor and to help others and to live a just livelihood, right? if we go back to some of the morality, I think we can, I'm kind of I'm not an anti-capitalist because it doesn't really make any sense. The world of capitalism I've just described is a world where everything is zero sum, where we believe that there are no partners, everyone's an enemy. And if they get rich, that means I get poorer. That's not how Islam has ever thought of commercial capitalism. We actually do believe in the mutual interdependencies of trade and exchange. And when we offer loans to people, or when we do business arrangements with them, or when we provide a business with capital and we share risk and we share profit, we're doing that because it's an equitable way to be. I think reviving some degree of Islamic economics from financial capitalism, from industrial capitalism, from, I think, rapacious capitalism that is commodity capitalism, that basically we're rich because we have resources. We really need to go back to basics and sort of understand what is the point of commerce and exchange for Muslims. Why do we want, and how do we get wealth? And I think we've actually lost it. We really have sort of lost the ethos of our own abilities to trade with one another. The difficulty is, and we've spoke about it the whole time, is that there's a massive divergence between the commodity-rich Muslim nations and then the vast majority of us who are commodity poor and are reliant on others. But in some ways, and if we think about, Islamically, the importance of complementarities, that Allah doesn't make anyone equal because he needs us to rely on one another, that's the perfect relationship. You have countries with commodities and countries without them. So the relationship should be clear. We should be providers of commodities to the Muslim countries that need us. And what do those countries provide us? With labor, their populations. The UAE doesn't have any people. There are really any Qataris, right? So they need the labor. That's a version of mutual exchange. In some way it does happen, but I don't think it's happened on a level in which we believe that God has given us different qualities as Muslim nations. So we should rely on each other economically to become closer to one another. So I think the difficulty is, how, as Muslims, do we not fall into the zero-sum trap that I've described? How do we not fall into the mercantilist mentality where all dependency is bad because it can be weaponized against you? I think the thing that we do have as Muslims is we have this natural goodwill towards one another that just comes from being members of the Ummah. And actually, Iran is a very important example of that right now. There is a lot of goodwill from the Sunni world to the Iranians, right? Because we see a degree of resilience and their ability to stand up to aggression. Let's build on the goodwill and let's try, outside of the systems of the global financial system, to, I think, go back to commercial capitalism and develop trade relationships that are ones of mutual dependencies, because it's actually, I think it is an Islamic imperative. That is how Muslims are supposed to do business with one another. It will require a lot of education, but I guess that's why I'm on the podcast.
One final question for you, Mehreen. How did it happen? How did the Islamic world become an international trading world? Like, what did we do to get there?
I mean, historians have pored over this question, and depending on your perspective, one, you can say it was divinely ordained. Two, we spoke a lot about geography. If you think about where Islam originates, Makkah and Medina were important trading hubs in their own time, in pre-Islamic times for the Arabs. They connected Yemen to Syria. It was an important point of trade for merchants and for caravans to go through the area. And then as the Islamic world spreads, actually it becomes, Muslims gain territorial control over what we now call the choke points of the world economy. That was because the Islamic empire connected India to China, and it connected the Arab world, the Mediterranean, back to Western Europe. And this is not just, and it allowed people to do trade in Islamic areas by ensuring that the ports of Aden, that Malacca, that the Suez Canal today, that Hormuz, the Red Sea, Bab al-Mandab, the Bosphorus, all of these arteries that connect the most important points of the world economy were ruled over and overseen by Muslims. That was the jewel of our economic geography. And we used it in such a way to spread wealth and benevolence to the rest of the world. We connected the rest of the world through trade. We reintroduced things that were lost in the Roman and the Greek times, like monetary economy. The Chinese civilization, which was doing incredible things in terms of innovation, a lot of that was able and transmitted from China to the Western world through the Muslims. So in the same way that we intellectually inherited the Greco-Roman civilization and then bequeathed it back to Europe, we also took the commercial practices of the Romans and the Byzantines, which were lost in the Middle Ages in Europe, and then we built upon them with Islamic principles like profit is good, that private property is something that you should strive for, that you should have equitable means of making wealth. You know, there are various hadith that the good and the fair merchant is a man who is close to God, and people who are close to God. So the Prophet was a trader. The first three caliphs of the Islamic world were traders. And the importance of trade was that you do it fairly and you deal with people fairly. We want to talk about the revival of Islamic economics. Well, we still, as an ummah, have jurisdictional control over the most important choke points in the world economy. And why can't we play a benevolent role to ensure that these areas once again become thriving ports and arteries where people exchange with one another, instead of what's happening right now, which is that we are using them as instruments for war. They're becoming instruments for war and domination, to cut countries off, to allow some countries preferential access. We still have the marvel of this economic geography. Our ummah is still very much concentrated in all of the areas, the choke points that we've spoken about. Do we not have a moral responsibility to ensure that they work properly, and that the wealth and the transit that goes through them is something that benefits the whole world? I think it will require a lot of strategic thinking. It does require a lot of excavation of our own history about how these places were managed. But the truth is that you just look at the Silk Road, you look at Samarkand, you look at what Cairo was under the Fatimids, a Shia empire. And you look at the degree to which the Muslim world was able to just have an agreement about how you do trade well, and you become wealthy in this earth for something higher. And, you know, my argument is that Muslims invented free trade. If free trade is disappearing, maybe it's our responsibility to bring it back.
Mehreen Khan, I mean, it's a fascinating conversation and a really great point to end with. Thank you so much for your time today.
Jazakallah khair.
Assalamu alaikum. Now you've reached the end of this show, and the fact that you've stayed until the very end tells me that you truly believe in our work. Please consider making a one-off donation or becoming a member by visiting thinkingmuslim.com/membership. Now your contributions give you exclusive behind-the-scenes access and the ability to ask questions to our guests, and monthly calls with myself, my team, and our guests like Sami Hamdi. Jazakallah khair, and keep us in your du'as.